been an extraordinary day. I've learned many things. I learned from Richard that Kierkegaard is in fact the one who discovered portfolio theory. And I learned from Abby, from whom I always learn, that there was such a thing as Kim Kierkegaard Kardashian. Who would have, Twitter, right? Who would have thought? And from Kimmer, how to rethink the notion of leap, and from Daniel and Richard, many other things. Today's conference grew out of a dinner that Richard, Rob, Ned Phelps, and I had a few weeks ago, hence the short time for arranging it, with our friend and colleague from Finland, Esa Saarinen. And in the course of that dinner, I happened to mention that May 5th was going to be the 200th anniversary of Kierkegaard's birth. And I tried to figure out something to do, but never got anywhere. Richard took the idea and ran with it, and before I knew it, everything that came to fruition today was in process. It seems an unlikely pairing in some ways, the Center for Capitalism and Society and Department of Religion to talk about Kierkegaard. But as I've had the privilege to get to know Ned, who's an extraordinary person, and Richard as well, I've been very impressed by the way they are rethinking issues in economic theory, financial theory, and the like, in some ways deeply critical of much of the economic theorizing that has been going on for quite a while. And in effect, in my simplistic way, the way I try to think about it is they're trying to get humanity back in the loop in certain ways. So there are different ways to think about these things. I also think that as I tried to figure out how I might put my side of this together, I will quote Heidegger. I think Ken has left. Heidegger says somewhere, and Nietzsche says something similar, that there's a difference between scholarship and thinking. Right? I've only ever been interested in scholarship insofar as it advances thinking. And so as I tried to think, to imagine people who might participate today, I was not particularly interested in Kierkegaard scholars. I don't think there's a lot to be learned from them, in all honesty. But I do think that there is a lot to be learned from people who take thinkers and think with them. I always tell students, there are thinkers you think about and thinkers you think with. You learn by thinking with great thinkers. You apprentice yourself to those thinkers. And for me, I've been thinking with Kierkegaard since 1967. It's a long time ago. When in college, I took 2 seminars from the man who introduced me to all these things, Stephen Kreitz. The first one was called The Dialectic of Alienation and Self-Reconciliation in Hegel, Feuerbach, and Marx. And this is a long title. And the second one was called Kierkegaard's Dialectic of Existence. It was a fascinating time to be in college. The city next to this town where my wife and I grew up out in New Jersey was literally burning. The Vietnam War was going on and protests were raging. And the way in which many young people who were protesting what was going on framed the debate was as a debate between the individual and the system. The system was the economic and military-industrial complex and the like, but that was the way it was framed. And I was reading Kierkegaard and Hegel. And strange though it seemed to me that that was precisely the problematic they were dealing with, the system, Hegel, and the individual, Kierkegaard. And I've spent all the years ever since trying to figure out how to find a middle way between those two thinkers. They're thinkers that I have thought with, and I no longer know where their thinking ends and my mind begins. That's why I call them ghosts. I do believe in ghosts. I believe they haunt us. I believe they live and speak through us. And Paul gave away all my secrets. Kierkegaard, in the common noun Kierkegaard in Danish means churchyard or cemetery, right? Kierkegaard. So I also believe in relics, and Paul mentioned. This is dirt from Kierkegaard's grave. So any of you who want to commune with Kierkegaard, I believe there are molecules of Kierkegaard in there. Paul said that I have Hegel ivy growing in my house. That's true. I pulled that from Hegel's grave in the early 90s. It's now about this big. There is no ivy on Kierkegaard's grave. So the best that I could do was to, Melville's one of my other favorites. I think Melville and Emerson are the Hegel and Kierkegaard and Hegel of American transcendentalism. So when Paul and I visited Melville's grave, there is ivy on Melville's grave. So I clipped a piece of Melville ivy and have that rooted. And in my effort to get the Kierkegaardian position and Hegelian position together, I've now grafted the Melville ivy onto the Hegel ivy. Kierkegaard was a strange dude. He wrote everything that he published in 13 short years, right? And he was 42, as we mentioned, when he died. And there are ironies, there are bitter ironies to the worldwide celebrations going on now. Ken this morning referred to the Corsair. That was a satirical publication that launched an extraordinary attack on Kierkegaard. He was, as Ken indicated, he never had a job. He inherited money. It was enough to live on, but there were periods because of the economic fluctuations in Europe at the time that he wasn't sure he was going to have enough to survive. The only two jobs for which he would be qualified were to be a priest. There was at the time a state church in Denmark, in which you remember by virtue of your birth. It's only recently, I forget when, that is no longer the case. And that, for Kierkegaard, represented the opposite, was socialization of religion, which represented the exact opposite of what true Christianity was about, which was the Christianity being the choice of the individual. And he, later in life, became a public intellectual by leveling a sustained attack on the Danish state church in the press of the day. And he was just lambasted for this. He was made the laughingstock of Denmark to such an extent that for many years after his death, Danes did not name their children Soren because the name was sort of associated with somebody like a tomfool and the like. There was an outrage, there was public outrage when his funeral was given in the central cathedral in Copenhagen. The Kierkegaard, the cemetery where he was buried, was then on the outskirts of the city. And there was all kinds of social unrest in the procession as the casket was taken to the cemetery. So I think Kierkegaard, as he watches what's going on today, would have a keen sense of irony about it all. He was, after all, the most important philosopher of irony in the Western tradition after Socrates. But to imagine that the work that he did in Denmark in the early part of the 19th century has had the impact that it has had is extraordinary. He was not known outside of Denmark until the second decade of the 20th century, really, when he was translated into German first, and then in the 1940s began to be translated into English. But his work was rediscovered in and around the time of the First World War. His vision of life made a lot more sense in that context than some of the earlier contexts. And philosophy and theology in the first half of the 20th century in much of Europe and in the United States was completely influenced by Kierkegaard and his thinking. And I think, as we've seen in the course of the day, he still remains a thinker well worth thinking with. Now, I'm going to conclude in fear and trembling because the Consulate General and his wife are here, but perhaps they will indulge me. Kan kun en smule dansk, og dat længe siden jeg har været I Danmark, det jeg kan blive lidt rusten. Jeg vil gerne takke over for deres dagstil I dagens arrangement. Jeg udtrækker her en special tak af det danske konsulat og det skandinaviske hus for deres store hjælp. Det arrangement kunne slet ikke have fundet stedet uden den interesse støtte Lisa som Ned Phelps, Richard Robb, Phil Coldiron, Jeff Nagy, Julia Clark Sofen, har ut de vest. Delge gerne I daget panel modetak her in store tak. Liegelen udetak a warm tak til Ricardo Castaneda voor den Tennigen auf Kierkegaard som Peter Vosta plaket. To alles tak, manga tak.